Of hands. Okay, there was a panel mid-afternoon about making deep learning impactful. That was also, it was a moderated panel. And there was a couple of issues that came up during the panel as challenges to applying deep learning research in the wild and enterprise. One was that often there's not enough data to support the training requirements to make deep learning work in the wild. And the second was on the fact that we need faster, more scalable hardware to sort of really put this into practice. So we're going to build upon that. We're not going to talk about hardware. We'll talk more about some of the other business challenges that companies inevitably will face if you're going to be deploying your products in regulated industries or in enterprise environments. So issues that didn't come up yesterday that are key here are interpretability of the models. So anyone who's working in financial services or healthcare, as we'll see with Leonard, knows that interpretability is a big issue. So these models might perform better and have better accuracy on classification tasks, but if you're using them, say, in a financial services context to predict whether or not somebody is worthy of credit, and you cannot account for which layer of the 152 layers in your convolutional neural network made that decision, you just can't use that model. You're done. So often, companies are forced to actually use much simpler, even linear regression type techniques in order to solve these problems because they need to account for transparency. Other issues include just people questions. Most people don't really know how these tools work, and they're not comfortable with probabilistic results. So if you're a doctor and you have a patient on a bed and you are trying to analyze those symptoms so as to diagnose something to cure their disease, if a result pops up and there's a 75% confidence rate that it's the right thing, and 75% we know is a pretty high accuracy, people might not be comfortable with those, those types of results. So there's different processes and workflows that need to be put into place to actually have enterprises really feel comfortable using these systems. So these are the types of things we're going to discuss. Delighted to be joined by Leonard D'Avolio, who is the CEO and co-founder of a company called Cyft, which is a predictive analytics company focused on the healthcare space that tries to identify which patients hospitals are working with are susceptible to higher risks so they can allocate resources effectively. Alongside that work, he is a assistant associate.
I think it's assistant.
Assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, and as well as Brigham Young's Women's Hospital. And Yuri Ivanov is the innovation scientist, which is a pretty cool title, at Rethink Robotics, which is in the robotic space, and they're working on sort of collaborative relationships between robots and humans so that you don't have scary rogue Terminator-like robots disrupting the workplace. And there's some really neat technology that goes into that. Yuri was coming from the research community, worked at MIT for a while, and has shifted more into the applied space because he was really excited about the mission of the company. So given the introduction, Leonard, let's start with you. When we think about deep learning in healthcare, a couple of applications that immediately come to mind are medical imaging. Mammogram technology was discussed yesterday. We just heard a presentation about AI cures, so sort of systems that are put in place to help people reliably take the drugs that have been prescribed to them. What does your company do, and what's the uniqueness there?
Yeah, so let me just set the context for where healthcare is starting in terms of the data it has and what it's trying to do with it. How many folks have worked with healthcare data in the past? Some familiarity, okay. So it's a mess, to be polite. The estimates right now is that the number is between 210 and 400,000 people die of completely preventable death per year in the US healthcare system. That places accidental death as the third leading cause of death in the US.
It's crazy.
It's insane and unfortunate, and I think a huge contributor to that is, despite the fact that it is the life and death field, there have not historically been efforts to try to learn from even recent history. Everything in medicine is learned anecdotally. The data that's captured in healthcare is captured for three purposes: financial reimbursement, legal protection, and to communicate narratively in one-on-one fashion between whoever is picking up the care as it's being handed off. So as a result of this, for the last 3 decades, the data that we capture in the electronic medical record systems is not set up as the quantifiable, reliable data that we have in other fields. So up to 50% of what's captured is completely unstructured text, which introduces issues of natural language processing. data as fundamental and important as what diseases you have can be up to 80% inaccurate. And I personally have led studies that weren't looking to, but discovered that number. We were working with 6 major hospitals in the colorectal cancer space. 80% of the people that had the code never had the cancer. So now they all had colonoscopies for the purpose of figuring out whether or not they had the cancer, but in order to get reimbursed fully for the colonoscopy, you get the diagnosis of colon cancer. So that's the foundation that we're starting on when it comes to helping healthcare learn from its existing data. So if 50% is unstructured, up to 80% is inaccurate, I started as a PhD student trying to figure out what methods would allow us to simply learn. What are we doing? To whom are we doing it? Is it working? What do we do more of? What do we do less of? These are the fundamental questions of improving anything, and healthcare is not currently able to do that. So the most appropriate technologies, as this audience knows, machine learning, natural language processing, and healthcare, the only way you get to use those is if you have a team of PhD students, which I was when I started, or you can buy models created elsewhere, which is great if you're willing to settle for the lowest common denominator claims data, which is 80% inaccurate, and if your problems are their problems, and if your population is their population. So the reason I started the research years ago, and now the reason it's a company, is in order for healthcare to begin to answer those fundamental questions of improvement, we've got unstructured data, and then we've got need. I'm trying to bridge the gap by putting the power of machine learning and natural language processing into the hands of the people who need it most. So it's a democratization of data science, it's a do-it-yourself model building, evaluation, and deployment play. And right now we're doing this not at the bedside, and we can talk about the reasons why, but mostly we're doing this to help with risk management, issues of coding, administration. You can give the operations people probabilistic assessments. You cannot right now at the point of care tell a doctor this is what you should do based on the results of a machine learning application. We're getting there, but there are still many steps to go.
And is that only cultural, or are there specific regulations or is there starting to be discussion on the regulatory framework around the acceptable use of these type of systems in the?
Yeah, so keep in mind right now, so there are things called formularies which decide what drugs you are allowed to get or not. And a hospital would decide what's on the formulary based on a contractual relationship or based on a team of doctors and administrators in a room simply making that decision. As a result of that decision, whether evidence-based or not, you have now implemented decision support. Mm-hmm. So right now, we're making decisions with limited data, with no data. By some estimates, up to 70% of the decisions made in healthcare are not backed by evidence. That doesn't mean they're wrong, it just means that there's a dearth of evidence to support it. So they're not regulatory, they are cultural. I mean, we're just starting to apply rules in healthcare, like if this person has a blood pressure at this level, then prescribe this drug. So there's just a long way to go until we're ready for that. But then some of the issues you started the conversation with, interpretability, to trust, these are, in my opinion, very much active areas of research and application in healthcare, where we're trying to figure out, based on those specific contexts, what is the way to translate the result of a machine learning prediction to a form that a doctor can use when the doctor is used to either reading a rule mm-hmm. or used to applying their own logic or used to using statistics which are based on 5 to 7 data points based on a logistic regression. So a big challenge is just the interpretation and culture.
I've seen a couple of, there's the Watson Health application coming to IBM, but I've seen a couple of startups that are also trying to build smart Q&A systems related to treatment and diagnosis support. And I think, and I'd be curious to know about your experience out there, there's a misperception from the public that these are systems that not only are easy to build, but are readily sort of, they're standard practice right now in the field, when, as I'd assume everybody this is in actuality, it's really hard to build a smart Q&A system that can parse through supporting research or even clinical data coming out of EMR systems, because they're really hard to extract data from that's usable. So what about the sort of the perception from non-technicians and basically medical practitioners with regards to expectations on what these systems should be able to do, and then educating them as to what's really possible these days?
Yeah, so the context in which this is being introduced right now, the public conversation is bipolar. It looks something like machine learning is going to cure cancer. Machine learning will not replace me as a doctor, right? As you mentioned, the actual opportunity for machine learning is not, as currently believed, throw in everything and hope that some diagnostic bubbles to the top magically. The actual applications of machine learning, what we like to say is machine learning is far more effective when the clinicians are the teachers. What specific problems are machine learning approaches best suited to solve, and then put the data in with a very specific end in mind. And so binary classification works better than any sort of general clustering approach when it comes to using these technologies specifically for medicine. What I'm starting to see happen is there are now more and more articles with people talking about real-world problems being solved with machine learning, but I'm only starting to notice that in the last couple months as opposed to the other challenge is right now this is all happening while electronic medical records are being adopted and installed. Basically, the federal government created an oligarchy of 3 electronic medical record vendors. Everyone in healthcare is scrambling to install them to realize a $17,000 per doctor check from the government for doing this. So there's a huge backlash against technology, specifically information technology in healthcare, because the electronic medical records that are being rapidly adopted are not designed, as we mentioned, to improve care. They're designed as billing systems. And so doctors are having to click more and more buttons, and now we're saying, hey, here's a new machine learning technology that you may want to adopt, and we're sort of getting thrown in that same bucket. They're also getting overwhelmed with analytics. Everything is analytics right now, and so it's very difficult to start a reasoned conversation around what problems you could solve when everything from a SQL query to deep learning is analytics in the mind of the healthcare system.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit and outside of healthcare and into manufacturing, traditionally analog industries. So playing on the notion not only of the opportunities but the challenges that you face in bringing in robotics that you're developing into, say, automotive, resistance that should be anticipated, data needs, and then we'll talk a little bit about training the systems as well.
Yeah, we have some of the problems that are similar to this, and we also have our unique problems because I guess the basics of this problem is that in learning systems we used to think about the output of our system being data. For us in robotics and in the industry, this is not an end-all be-all thing. It's just in support of something that we're already doing. And what we're doing is moving physical things. And so we don't have a luxury, if I may, of having what we call graceful failure mode. If something fails, something gets broken. So we cannot think about our decisions in purely statistical terms, or at the least we need to have sort of machinery that has very, very steep ROC curves. Then another aspect of this is that the cost of innovation, the capital cost of innovation on the factory floor is fairly steep. We typically bring our technological solutions to a very well oiled machine that has multiple components, and what happens is that if we innovate some small part of this very large process that goes from raw material to Tesla car, no relation, then we're solving some little problem, and each problem that we need to solve has a timer ticking. So sometimes we have to compete with very unique, very simple solutions, providing something more general. And if we can do faster than that, that typically is we're not going to be successful at that. Then other types of problems that we're having is that the equipment that we are trying to deliver, and we are a very unique company in this sense. That's what makes me believe in our mission, is that we're trying to make something that anybody can use. We're trying to make robots that anybody can use, unlike maybe Leonardo software that is showing the data to the doctor and to the doctors and practitioners in the medicine, which tend to be very highly educated people. Our robots are built to work with people at the assembly line. People who are not typically fortunate enough to have the education that people who designed this robot had. But we need to make it simple enough and quick enough and relatable enough and safe enough for these people to be able to operate it. Like basically like we all operate iPhone. Nobody took classes. Everybody knows how to use it. So this is sort of a thing that we need to do. And if any machine learning, if any AI comes into this picture, it needs to be lightning fast and dead simple to use. It could be as complicated as you can think of, but it had to be very simple and quick to use, because we simply don't have time to spend on training the robot by any complicated means, but we do end up training it. So
what algorithms are you using to train it? We talked a little bit about my intuition. I think robots, reinforcement learning, and then we were talking about the fact that the epochs would be actually relatively slow because there's not a lot of goals that are accomplished that can then give feedback to support that type of model. So how do you train them?
So I have to say that the applications of AI and machine learning in our robots are typically well, except the decision-making part, are typically pre-deployment. We use a lot of traditional methods of machine learning to characterize the joints, to figure out how to control the robot, and all those beautiful things that nobody ever sees. But what was something that when I joined the company, I figured out how they were designing these robots, and that was like an infancy. We didn't have a product yet. And I saw this great idea how you can bring this, the real world into your thinking very simply, sort of like when Apple introduced their graphical user interface and they had the mouse, and the mouse had one button. And I'm like, Windows, the PCs have two. It's like more advanced. But they managed to reduce their problems to the way in which one button is enough. You press a button and it knows. And so what was so magical to me when I joined is that the special design of the robot, that it has every joint in the robot senses force at the point where it's applied, which means that if you push it, it can measure how hard you pushed it, and yet it can resist, it can assist you. And so what we did to make it very simple for people to explain what the robot needs to do is we have this zero gravity mode, so to speak. You grab the robot's arm and just move it around, and it weighs like it weighs like a feather, even though it's a 50-pound arm. 50-pound arm. You can push it with your pinky, and you just show it. You need to pick this up. You need to place it over there, and there is some generalization. There is some planning involved, which happens sort of behind the scenes, outside person's knowledge. What person specifies is what needs to be done. That's it. And so that sort of opens up a whole different way of operating robots and running these tasks. And the AI that is used in the decision making is more of an old school than currently we see everybody working on. Mm-hmm. By the way, I have to comment on everybody's work. In the past few years, the machine learning became so viable and that it terrified Stephen Hawking. So I hear Elon Musk is building a rocket. So great job, everybody. So we're not quite there in AI that controls the robot, but definitely there are huge opportunities for this, in particular in situation assessment. It's a typical application, computer vision. When you roll the robot into a factory, it should just know what's around it. It should know where the equipment is. It should know which direction it's moving. It should know how heavy those things are that it needs to pick up. Another great opportunity there is sort of similar to your application, looking at the whole system, looking at the factory level analytics, specifying what parameters are important to the speed of a production process, and so that's another way, but it's a little harder to get because people typically keep this data close to their chest.
I think that, well, that's actually, we can push into another one of the challenges of deploying these things. So people keeping data close to their chest. In my experience working with large enterprises, they'll bring in a chief data scientist who's tasked with finding ways to either reduce the bottom line or increase the top line in their company using the data assets that they have at hand, but people are unwilling to part with data that's sort of affiliated with their department. Does that occur are you finding that in healthcare, or is it more related to the systems?
Well, healthcare is highly regulated as far as data, not as far as data sharing, but as far as data losing.
Yeah.
So there's HIPAA compliance, and hospitals or any what's called a covered entity, any organization responsible for keeping the patient's data private and secure can be levied enormous fines and then n-fold damage to their public perception. So cloud computing has made it possible for us to basically build high performance computing environments that can quickly and accurately determine which patient is most likely to end up with end-stage renal disease in the next 6 months. And I can't send that environment to 10 hospitals while we're building it and while it's evolving. So a big question for us in building the company is, will healthcare organizations send their data? Because it's not something that they're used to doing. Health plans do this rather readily, but hospitals and care providers do not. What we're finding is it has not been an issue thus far. On the research side, it's more territorial. Researchers get large grants, and they use those grants to collect the data, and they're not so comfortable with the idea of simply giving away those economics because they have to publish their papers. But on the hospital side, where now, because the value proposition is shifting from fee for service, basically right now, hospitals get paid more money if you arrive in an ambulance than if you don't arrive at all, right? So that's shifting to basically value-based care. And with the writing being on the wall and with learning from their data being so fundamental to improving, more and more of them are sending their data off to have others do things with it. But it's just starting to come around, and they're not willing to do it for 30 vendors. And so it's not as simple as we're going to do business, sign an MSA and a BAA, and you're on your way.
Yeah. Questions from the audience?
In March 2015, executives from Google, General Motors, Lyft, and Delphi appeared before a Senate hearing relating to their efforts in self-driving cars. And basically the question was from the senator to these executives whether they would answer yes or no to mandatory standards that protect the privacy and enforce the safety of these AI solutions to cars. Basically, protection against deadly hacks that could result in loss of life. So if we just change the context to medical diagnosis or to robotics that work on the assembly floor next to humans, would you answer yes or no to that question?
To accepting federally mandated standards? Yes. Everything I do is governed by federally mandated standards. When I was at the Department of Veterans Affairs, I led the development of their genomic science infrastructure. We collected the DNA, EMR, blood survey data of, I think we're up to 600,000 veterans. And I was the guy who got dragged in front of Congress if something went wrong. So, and healthcare regulation is more the norm. There's a lot of conversation now around whether, as you were suggesting, whether or not decision support should be like an FDA device or intervention, because the machine is making the recommendation. And so should that be regulated? Should there be evidence-based standards? I think no one would argue with the idea of ensuring privacy, safety, security, et cetera, but industries get nervous about the idea of federal bureaucrats telling them how it should be. So I mean, there's the tension.
I guess this is why he got a lot of deflection for the answers. No one answered directly yes or no.
Oh, are you trying to hold me to a yes or no?
Kinda.
You'll see my lawyers.
Well, in robotics, just like in healthcare, everything is strictly regulated. If you put something next to people, there is numerous federal regulations about what it means to have certain degree of safety, and it regulates what sort of protection equipment people need to wear. I mean, they're still allowed to be thinking what they're doing. I mean, if you give a robot a knife, it's much less safe, regardless of the safety regulation. But there is all kinds of rankings about safety and what people, what they allowed to do around people. They need to slow down, they need to stop, they need to, so ours is probably one of the safest ones out in the market. And in fact, if you ever visit our office, we have robots everywhere. And people who haven't been to a robotics lab, they never surprised. They're like, oh yeah, of course, we see it in the movies all the time. If you have been to a robotics lab, the first thing people ask, oh, where are your hard hats? Where are your cages? So like, none. People just duck under the arms, things are moving, and like, eh. So, that said, federal regulations, absolutely, to the letter. We need to be certified.
A sort of, this isn't quite, should the government get involved, but I moonlight as a law school professor, and I've done a lot of work on data privacy in my past life, and currently am part of a group of data science practitioners, mostly in media and advertising in New York City, that are thinking about, from a practitioner's perspective, what are the ethical standards we want to hold ourselves to with regards to use of this data when you're in media, advertising, et cetera. There's no regulations to speak of. What surprises me the most is that there should be more constructive communication between the two domains, because those that are in charge of setting policy to think through these regulations don't actually know a lot about how the tech works on the back end. So thinking about interpretability as an issue in a deep learning model, they don't know that there's a million layers and it's hard to actually understand which one is doing feature engineering and identification. Similarly, those working in data don't know that there's privacy principles that exist is the lowest common denominator between the 170 international privacy laws that are out there. I was talking to someone earlier on about how in China it's very, very different from a medical perspective than here in the States. And they're reinventing wheels that have already been constructed. So I think that, and the White House just put out this sort of, like ethics for machine intelligence commission that's going to be a bunch of public workshops across the country in the next couple of months. And I think there's efforts moving in that direction, but there should be more constructive dialogue between people working in different areas that actually can impact development on both sides, I think, as these technologies continue to proliferate.